Good evening. I'm Michael Ignatieff, the Rector and President of Central European University in Vienna and Budapest, and this is a presidential lecture. We're honored to have Leslie Topp, who will be talking to us about the architecture of the Otto Wagner Areal, where CEU will be finding its permanent home in 2025. And we'll have Emese Lafferton from our history department commenting on Leslie's lecture. I'm here just to explain why we're doing this. We're a university with a mission to tell the truth about who we are and where we come from. We're about to go to this extraordinary site on the outskirts of Vienna. And it's a site that has a very complicated history. And so this series of lectures is an attempt to uncover and unpack that history so that we're truthful about the dark sides of that history. And we've had 2 lectures on those dark sides. And today we're going to go back to essentially the founding moment and talk about the intentions behind the creation of this extraordinary complex. This at its opening in 1907, it was, if I'm not wrong, the largest psychiatric asylum in the world. And now in the 21st century, it'll become the campus for a great university. So that's the story we're going to be looking at tonight. This session will be recorded. Leslie Topp will speak for about 40 minutes. Emese Lafferton will have a comment of about 10, 12 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion. And then there'll be time for your questions, but we welcome you all here. And I'm going to hand over to Professor Michael Miller, who has been steering the whole university through our attempt to understand the heritage of this extraordinary site. And so I'll hand it over to Michael now. Thanks.
Okay, first of all, thank you to Leslie Topp and Emese Lafferton for being our speakers tonight. I'm going to share the screen. So tonight's lecture, Steinhof, A Difficult Modernity by Leslie Topp, who is a professor of architectural history at Birkbeck College at the University of London and has done extensive research on the psychiatric hospital that is the main set of buildings in our future home, and we're going to be moving into part of it. Leslie Topp is a widely published author who deals with the intersection of architectural history and psychiatry and mental illness. One of her books, Freedom and the Cage, deals with the caged bed, which we know was in use at Steinhof up until the late 20th century. Modern Architecture and Psychiatry in Central Europe, 1890 to 1914. She's also the author of Architecture and Truth in Fin de Siècle, Vienna, published by Cambridge University Press, and also of Madness and Modernity, or one of the editors of this museum exhibition volume on mental illness and the visual arts in Vienna in 1900. So as you can see, we can probably think of no better scholar to talk about Steinhof as a psychiatric institution, the place of this in Vienna at the Fin de Siècle. And what's important, I think, for us is that this is the first of our lectures that really hasn't focused on the Spiegelgrund period. We heard 2 wonderful yet heartbreaking lectures by Edith Scheffer and Herwig Czech, dealing specifically with the period of child murder. And it's actually, I think, somewhat refreshing to hear a little bit more about the early days of Steinhof. And apologies for the a little bit of noise in the background here. Our respondent is a colleague of ours in the history department, Emese Lafferton, who is also on the Steinhof visioning group. Her forthcoming book, Hungarian Psychiatry, Society and Politics in the Long 19th Century, You can see this is also directly connected to the topic we're dealing with tonight. She works a lot on racial science, eugenics, especially in the context of the Habsburg Empire. It has been my custom to introduce a third person at most of these talks. And this is a person who can't be with us right now. And this is someone who unfortunately is one of the victims of the Spiegelgrund period. And I'm just going to introduce her very briefly. And this is Alfredo Kranzler, born in April of 1942, was admitted to a Glancing Children's Hospital here in Vienna with bronchitis. And as we know from last week, this was part of the larger supply chain that brought children to Spiegelgrund in the 1940s. She was someone who had bronchitis, and we can see from one of the reports that she was diagnosed as having physical and mental development not in accordance with her age. And she was eventually admitted to Steinhof Pavilion 15, which is, of course, one of the pavilions that Herwig Czech and Edith Scheffer both talked about, one of the death pavilions. And I have part of her admissions log statement on the screen right now. I'm not going to read from it, but it's there for you to look at. And you can get a sense of the kinds of reports that were made of the children admitted to Steinhof. And then we can see her fate, that she was released from Steinhof, then readmitted, and she caught measles and the whooping cough, and she died at 1.5 years old. And the reason I chose her is because her admission date was on May 5th, 1943, so this is the anniversary of that. And hopefully in tonight's lecture, we will hear more about the utopian and forward-looking aspects of Steinhof, and not solely the period that we've been focusing on so much right now. And I very much welcome our first speaker, and that is Leslie Topp. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'll just share my screen. Okay, thanks so much for the introduction and for the invitation to take part in this really exciting series. Buildings have long and often eventful lives. The arrival of the Central European University at Steinhof in 2025 will be the latest chapter in the history of the site. The last two lectures in this series by Edith Scheffer and Herwig Czech dealt with the darkest chapter, the Nazi regime's use of the Steinhof Psychiatric Hospital and the crimes against disabled and mentally ill children and adults committed there, as well as the long afterlife of those crimes and the victims' search for recognition and justice. The period from 1903 to 1907, encompassing the planning and building of the Lower Austrian institutions for the cure and care of the mentally ill, was Steinhof's originary moment. The complex at that time was shiny and new, a white city shimmering on the hillside, as it was called by a contemporary critic. But that shininess and the stark contrast it presents with the darkness of the site's history between 1938 and 1945 shouldn't entrance us so much that we imagine the Steinhof of 1907 was the product of motives that were enlightened or utopian in any straightforward way, although there were elements of that. Likewise, the modernity of the complex's architecture and urban scheme, and the close involvement of the father of modern architecture, Otto Wagner, in its design, should, I argue, be understood as a rhetorical gesture rather than taken at face value. The institution's architectural scenography was part of, the most powerful and effective part of, a public relations campaign carried out by the Christian Social Government to present their prestige project as existing at the cutting edge of science and public works. As a public relations campaign, it was so successful that we can hear echoes of it over 100 years later in the way in which the original Steinhof of 1907 is still admired and even cherished, distinguishing it from every other former psychiatric hospital that I'm aware of. The usual 21st century fate of the large peripheral lunatic asylum, to use the term still current around 1900, is to crumble and sink into obscurity, to be transformed beyond recognition, usually into high-end housing, or to be seen as a gloomy relic of a time when large numbers of disabled, sick, troubled, and troublesome people were locked up for long periods against their will. Steinhof is a relic of such a time. I won't be speaking in this lecture in any detail about how psychiatry was practiced and how patients were cared for and managed there. For that information, I refer you to the extensive historical research by Professor Eberhard Gabriel, Dr. Sophie Ledeboer, and others. And we'll hear from Emese Lafferton more about that context of psychiatric practice and patient experience. I just mentioned that the opening of Steinhof represents the late peak of the mass institutionalization of mentally ill and learning disabled people, and that the vast majority of people treated and confined there entered involuntarily. What has interested me particularly about the psychiatric history of Steinhof, since it had important implications for the architecture of the institution, is the fact that it was built at a time when serious doubts about the scientific relevance and social worth of the large asylum were being aired, and concerns about abuses of individual rights and liberties were widely publicized. The shiny modernity of the institution's image, conveyed through architecture and disseminated through sophisticated visual publicity, needs to be understood as a concerted reaction to the difficult moment of its origins. Taking a step back from this interpretive framework, I'll spend some time now sketching in the background and context for Steinhof and the physical form it took. The new hospital was built to serve the imperial metropolis of Vienna, which until then had committed its mentally ill to the asylum at Brunelfeld in the 9th district, hard up against the outer ring of fortifications, on the site occupied since the late 1960s by the Allgemeine Krankenhaus. As was typical for asylums built in Central Europe up to the 1870s, Brunelfeld was constructed on a so-called corridor plan. Long articulated wings extended symmetrically, with male patients on one side, female on the other, and administration and services on the central axis. Almost everything was under one roof, and circulation took place via extensive corridors with single rooms, secure cells, dormitories, and day rooms ranged along one or both sides. The impression architecturally was of an imposing monastery or other residential institution in the midst of extensive planted grounds. Beginning in the 1870s in Germany, we see a marked change in asylum design with the introduction of what was called the Pavilion System, or more often the villa system. In place of the monolithic structure surrounded by open space, multiple smaller buildings were spread throughout the institution's grounds. Sex segregation still being paramount, pavilions for male and female patients were grouped in different parts of the territory, with buildings housing the various shared facilities from the chapel and assembly hall to the kitchen and laundry, each in separate structures. The whole could be arranged symmetrically around a central axis, but other more informal configurations were also embraced. The institution I'm showing you in this slide, built by the government of Saxony and situated outside of Leipzig at Alt-Scherbitz, was highly influential internationally. Here the idea was that the rich array of separate structures allowed spaces to be tailored to the treatment and management of different types of patients. Freedom was the key slogan. In the corridor-style asylum, all patients lived in high security conditions, with very little liberty to move about within or outside of their accommodation. In the villa system as developed at Alt-Scherbitz, features such as secure cells, reinforced windows, and locks on doors could be reserved only for those patients whose behavior was deemed to warrant them. Patients were divided into categories, essentially according to how manageable they were. The categories, which were repeated in many asylums, were noisy, semi-quiet, and quiet. And efforts were made to design the pavilions, especially for the quiet patients, so that they resembled rural cottages, or the kinds of villas that you might find in the villa suburbs being developed in many Central European cities at that time. These measures were both about actual changes in the institutional regime and about the image that the institution conveyed to the outside world. Here at Alt-Scherbitz, the regime was referred to as open-door treatment. Although it should more accurately have been referred to as open and closed, and in some cases locked door treatment, the emphasis was on patient freedom. The designers used a combination of individual building design, urban and landscape design, and the incorporation of existing rural buildings to communicate a sense of informality and closeness to nature, conjuring up cultural associations with ideals of individual liberty in a romantic mode. Between the late 1890s and the First World War, in the Austrian half of the double monarchy, a series of 7 large and ambitious psychiatric institutions were built, Steinhof being the largest. And it's those 7 institutions that I treat in the book Freedom in the Cage. Since 1864, responsibility for the provision for people suffering from mental illness who could not afford private treatment fell to the individual crown lands. Germany was recognized in the later 19th century as the leader in psychiatry, and for decades, Austria lagged well behind in terms of the number of beds provided per head of population. In the 1890s, Crown land social welfare authorities, encouraged by campaigning psychiatrists, became convinced of the need for more and larger, more up-to-date institutions. At a time when the Crown lands were flexing their political muscle within the empire, they recognized asylum building as a way of raising their profile, both internally and internationally. None of the other powers devolved to them allowed them to make quite such a dramatic impact on the landscape. In the Crown land of Lower Austria, the Christian Socialists came to power in 1896. They took over from their Liberal Party predecessors embryonic plans to build a new asylum on agricultural land between the villages of Mauer and Oerling near Amstetten in the western part of the province. They commissioned the head of their buildings office, Carlo Bogue, to devise a new asylum for 1,000 patients using the villa system. The result, opened in 1902, was in aesthetic terms a novel interpretation of the villa system plan, replacing the natural-seeming informality seen at Alt-Scherbitz with a crystalline axial symmetry and rectilinearity. The quasi-vernacular architectural vocabulary of pitched roofs and asymmetrical massing that you see at Alt-Scherbitz and other institutions was replaced with flat-roofed compact volumes and simplified fresh plaster ornamentation. The result was a complex of buildings emulating current trends in Vienna, and specifically emulating the work of architects around Otto Wagner. It's worth noting here as well the relatively small scale of the buildings. And what you see at the bottom left is one of the patient pavilions. Only 2 stories there, as you can see. And the existence of a so-called Pflegerdorf, a small street of crisp and simple modernist double houses where patients were housed with nurses within the same homes as nurses' families, in a transition to life in the outside world. As I've argued in what I've written about Mauer-Oerling, the institution was exemplary of the distinctive Christian social approach to public works. John Boyer, the key historian of the Christian Social Party, wrote that they, quote, managed to convert what in other Central European contexts were commonplace institutional and organizational changes into political symbols of the first order, end of quote. The Christian Socialists saw new public institutions as key political tools, signaling their administrative superiority to their liberal predecessors in government and their international standing in terms of public administration. They were always keen to promote what they were doing as modern and innovative. But this sat alongside an approach to public assistance and welfare that was traditionally paternalistic, as Boyer has pointed out. The Christian Socialists sought to put clear blue water between themselves and the increasingly popular Social Democrats. They rejected moves to redistribute income, restricted to a minimum any state assistance to the able-bodied poor, built no social housing, and focused all their social assistance on those at the extreme margins of society, including the mentally ill. This political context is equally relevant to Steinhof. As the building of Mauer-Oehling was underway, the Lower Austrian Authority embarked on a significantly more ambitious intervention in the world of asylum psychiatry, a new asylum for the imperial capital. Leopold Steiner, the chief official for both Mauer-Oehling and Steinhof, stated that the aim was to create, quote, a new asylum that will put all other institutions, both at home and abroad, in the shade, end of quote. They purchased an enormous area of agricultural and vacant land overlooking Vienna from the west, on the edge of the Wienerwald. The site was seen as ideal. It was elevated and therefore benefited from good air and views. While it was far enough away to be protected from noise, pollution, and encroachment by the built-up parts of the city, it was close enough to be both well-connected and visible. There were two important and controversial decisions made in the early planning process for Steinhof. One was to plan for an institution at an extremely large scale, as Michael Ignatieff mentioned at the beginning, both in terms of the area covered and in the number of beds. There were 2,200 beds when it was opened. There was constant upward pressure on the capacity of institutions at this time, and a fair amount of hand-wringing about how over-large institutions could become unmanageable. Experts worried as well that the liberal impulses of the open door system would be much more difficult to maintain with very large numbers. Some argued that the government should build at least 2 smaller institutions rather than one large one. But the practicalities of land availability, along with the seductive idea of Vienna being home to a mega institution, the largest yet in Europe, meant that arguments for multiple smaller institutions never really gained traction. The other key decision was to devote a very large area of the new institution to a separate, largely self-contained section for patients who paid for their accommodation and treatment in what came to be called the sanatorium, which you can see the development over at the left of the image here. It was standard practice to have a small number of pavilions for paying patients within state institutions, but the Steinhof sanatorium was unique in scale and in having its own separate facilities. The same Carlo Bogue, this time elevated to Carlo von Bogue, who was responsible for the design of the Mauer-Oehling Asylum, devised this first site plan for the new institution in 1903, which I'm showing you here. A contemporary commentator said that the plan looked, quote, as if the buildings each had a different owner, each of whom had on his own piece of land oriented his facade this way or that, higher or lower in the terrain, whichever was cheapest, as if someone had rolled the buildings out like dice. This was a very different plan from that devised by Bogue for Mauer-Oehling a few years before. The main reason for the contrast was topography. Mauer-Oehling was built in a more or less flat area. The land purchased for Steinhof, on the other hand, had a significant slope and irregular contours, which required a great deal of money and engineering effort to undertake the earthworks that would make a more regular plan possible. I speculate as well that there was another factor at play, a desire to underplay the excessive size of the new institution, softening the impact of the institution's scale by laying it out as a loosely related series of independent structures. At some point fairly early on in the planning process, Otto Wagner became involved. Wagner was Vienna's most high-profile international architectural star at that time, and occupies a highly significant place in the history of early modernism in architecture, in Austria, but also internationally. His influential treatise, Moderne Architektur, first published in 1895, really introduced that term, modern architecture, into common use. His masterclass at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts was a hothouse of innovative architecture, attended by the rising stars of architecture from across the empire. He had already secured a major public commission for the stations and other architecture of the Vienna Stadtbahn, including the Karlsplatz station you can see here. And in 1903, he won the competition for the headquarters of the Post Office Savings Bank in the Stubenviertel section of the Ringstrasse. Wagner's first interest in the new hospital project was signaled by his development of a design for the chapel, or the church, which he saw as an opportunity to put into practice the ideas that he had been long developing about what a modern church should look like. He then went on to insert himself forcefully in the design process for the institution as a whole, by devising a new site plan which departed significantly from the first plan by Bogue. He won over the key Crown Land Committee responsible for the project and eventually the Lower Austrian Parliament, convincing them to spend very significant extra funds to carry out those earthworks necessary for his scheme. Wagner's plan was a tour de force of master planning, in which all the elements of the extensive complex were united in an exquisitely proportioned whole. The church formed the highest element of a central axis of buildings serving and governing all the parts of the institution, but it also sat outside of the grid of the main institution and acted as an orienting node for the complex of workshops, laundry, and agricultural buildings to the east, as well as for the sanatorium to the west. And I'll point out these various sections in a second. Working with pre-existing building designs from the Lower Austrian Office of Public Works, the Bauamt, for all the buildings other than the church, he deployed a combination of what we'd now call hard and soft landscaping, roads, paths, boundary walls, and planting, to create a plan that was at once rational and rectilinear on the one hand, and organic on the other, in the sense that everything worked together. Aesthetically, there was nothing additive or accidental about it. For a detailed account of individual pavilions and other buildings, and of the work of the building office team under Franz Berger, who took over when Bogue died in 1903, I refer you to the excellent collaborative study of the hospital's built fabric, including a catalogue of its 60 original buildings, led by Professors Sabine Placholm-Forsthuber and Carolina Jäger-Klein from the Technical University in Vienna. For now, I'll just point out the key components of the complex, and I'll use my arrow here, which I hope you can see. So over here, of course, you have the workshops, a laundry, agricultural buildings, but also up here, the secure pavilion for patients who were committed through the criminal justice system. Over here is the mortuary building, known in German as the Prosektor, which had a combination of chapel, mortuary chapel for funerals, and an autopsy room and labs. And we heard about the specimens from the Spiegelgrund that were kept there for many years in the last lecture. Here on the central axis, you have the administration building, the theater, the kitchen, and then the church here at the top of the axis. Over here on the eastern side were the male pavilions, within close reach, quite deliberately, of the workshops and agricultural buildings over here. And then the female pavilions over on the other side here. These pavilions were then also divided into sections into pavilions for quiet patients on the ones closest to the central axis. The next row over were for the semi-quiet patients, and then finally the noisy patients in the outer pavilions here. Another subdivision was the division into acute. The two rows at the front of the complex, closest to the entrance, were for acute curable patients, with the chronic patients towards the back. Then over here, there was a zone, a kind of cordon sanitaire that was planted with a grove of pine trees to separate this main institution, which was intended for what was called in English pauper patients, wards of the state, from the section for paying patients, the sanatorium, which you have over here, which had its own administration building and kitchen, and also a very elaborate and well-equipped kurhaus with its own swimming pool. And then the pavilions accommodating first and second class patients. That section was divided off from the rest of the institution after the First World War and became the hospital for the treatment of pulmonary conditions, which it remained as up until very recently, I understand. This way of organizing the various elements of the institution was already there in Bogue's plan. It was set out in detail in advance in the brief for the institution developed by psychiatric consultants and bureaucrats. Apart from the huge scale and the inclusion of the large dedicated section for paying patients, the psychiatric components were conventional, even retrograde for the time. If they had gone ahead and built Steinhof on Bogue's plan, there would have been comment on its magnificent site and generous facilities, but otherwise my hunch is that it would not have made much of a splash, and may well have been criticized for its overblown scale, as well as for other reasons that I'll go into later. What Otto Wagner did was to give the institution cultural force and meaning. Wagner could see that this enormous project offered an extremely rare opportunity to do something that he and his fellow architects at the turn of the century were entranced with, to build a city from scratch on a blank slate. Impassioned criticism of the architecture of the recent past and concerns about the shape the metropolis was taking under uncontrolled speculative capitalism fed into the desire to start again, creating settlements in which every element formed an integrated part of a coherent master plan under the control of one designer. A community built from scratch could be both a symbol and a tool of cultural regeneration. We see these ambitions manifested in the projects that students in Wagner's masterclass at the Academy produced in their final year. An example is Wunibald Deiniger's project for an artist's colony from 1903, which I'm showing you here. On a slope ringed by hills, individual structures housing artist studios are arranged on a grid, aligned to a central axis, which terminates in the focal point of the complex, a house of work, a kind of cult building, which was seen as essential for utopian projects like this. This slide shows the choreographed accumulation of elements that went into the emphasis on the church as what I would argue is the kind of cult building for the complex at Steinhof. It was crucial that it was positioned at the top of the central axis of buildings and at the highest point of the site, set apart and with nothing obstructing the view. But that wasn't enough. This position was reinforced by the flanking lines of pavilions, whose axes were slightly tilted inwards towards the church. The swooping switchbacks of the paths provide another framing element. This drawing particularly focuses on the planting of double rows of cypresses like lines of sentries on either side of the ribbon of central buildings, culminating in a rich crown of trees, shrubs, and terrace around the sides and backs of the church. So we can see why the Steinhof project appealed to Wagner. Why did Wagner appeal to the planners of Steinhof? That's what I'll go on to discuss. I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that the institution's image, of which its architecture and visual publicity were key elements, can be understood as a concerted reaction to the difficult moment of its origins. We think of the anti-psychiatry movement as a phenomenon of the 1960s and 70s, but there were vocal and persistent critics of the asylum system in several European countries in the late 19th century. The writer and polemicist Karl Kraus, for instance, used his journal Die Fackel to demand justice for people deprived of their liberty in Austrian asylums, and to attack what he saw as the unbridled power of the asylum psychiatrist. In 1904, the imperial government responded to a series of scandals in the press about unjust confinement and abuses in asylums by holding an expert-led investigation, drafting new laws in 1909 in the relevant areas. In the professional press, psychiatrists expressed deep concern about the damage to the reputation of the profession and its institutions caused by anti-psychiatric campaigns. The solution they pointed to was good publicity, with the asylum buildings playing a central role. They advocated opening institutions up for visits, inviting the press in to photograph and report, disseminating attractive images, including elaborate models intended for exhibition, like this one of Steinhof. But all that depended on having an institution to show people and to photograph and publicize that looked open, scientifically led, attractive, and culturally meaningful. I now want to move briefly to another slightly later psychiatric hospital, one of the group of 7 new state institutions built in the Austrian half of the monarchy in the years before the First World War. This one was built outside of Krakow by the Crown Land of Galicia beginning in 1910. It was much smaller, with about 530 patients when it eventually opened. Like Steinhof, it was ambitious architecturally and urbanistically. Its buildings were designed in a national romantic mode that may look old-fashioned to us, but which aligned with progressive ideals of the time in that region. Its site plan shows a very different approach to the challenge of the villa asylum from that seen at Steinhof. Rather than the blank slate of the former agricultural land being subordinated to an overall grid, the space is transformed into a free-flowing asymmetrical park. At Steinhof, the open spaces conform to the rational organizing principles of the architecture. In this asylum, the buildings are cited not only in nature, but for nature's sake, like the kinds of buildings you'd find dotted around a large country park. This leads me to be able to say something about the kind of patient experience promised by these different approaches. At Steinhof, most exterior space is enclosed within the boundary walls and fences around the gardens on the south side of the patient pavilions. When the patients leave those areas to go to the church or to the theater, for instance, it is to travel along straight roads that function as outdoor corridors. At Krakow, patients moving beyond the boundaries of their pavilion and its connected garden and enter an open park with meandering paths. Thinking back to the origins of the villa system asylum at Alt-Scherbitz, that asylum near Leipzig where the open door system was promoted, it's worth recalling that architecture and the organization of space were seen to have important roles to play in the amount of individual freedom patients might experience within the confining bounds of the institution. The villa system was meant to replace monolithic looming carceral structures with domestic scale buildings where patients could, in theory, live lives closer to nature, more normal, less institutional. There was no question of disbanding the institution itself, far from it, but there was a great deal of detailed thought and design creativity put into how to soften its image and also, to an extent, its practices. The promoters of these institutions imagined that they could offer a kind of designed-in freedom. Steinhof in this context represents another path, a tightening of control, a return to order. The patient pavilions were enormous, some of them 3 stories high over an elevated basement story. So for instance, this pavilion you can see over here. Far removed from anything domestic and really highly institutional as architecture. Designers of other institutions went to great lengths to avoid the use of solid boundary walls around patients' gardens. They were seen as reminiscent of an earlier, more unashamedly carceral regime. Here at the Villa System Asylum at Prague, we see the garden bounded by a seemingly porous hedge. At Steinhof, a solid 2.5 meter, 8-foot wall enclosed the gardens attached to the pavilions for noisy patients, and I'm indicating that in the image in the distance of this image with the red arrow. Finally, I want to take us inside the patient pavilions by looking at two floor plans. The first shows the pavilion for noisy patients at the Krakow Asylum, a one-story structure. Some context on spaces for patients is needed to help us understand this curious and seemingly rather chaotic patchwork of rooms, all opening onto each other. In the corridor style asylums of the mid-19th century, patients classified as noisy, that is violent, loud, unwilling to conform to the institutional regime, were housed in wings at the outer ends of the building. Each patient slept alone in a single cell, and if they were deemed to be too out of control to be in company, they were secluded in their cell during the day as well. These parts of the asylum came to be known as Topp-Abteilungen, or raving wards, and consisted of rows of cells giving onto a corridor. With the reforms to asylum design of the 1870s and the introduction of the villa system, the raving ward was seen to epitomize everything that was wrong with the old regime. Many argued that cells, with their associations with the penitentiary, had no place in the reformed asylum. It was felt that there would always be a need to seclude disturbed patients, though, and there would always be a need to seclude disturbed patients, though, and so single rooms should be available. But how to distinguish between the cell and the single room? The way we see that distinction being made in the Krakow Pavilion is partly through nomenclature, which is taken very seriously. And you can see I've relabeled this plan in English, but where it says single room there, that's a direct translation of the Polish, specifically not cell. But the other way that the distinction is made is by devising another way of organizing space that didn't involve a corridor. Each of the 4 single rooms in the plan gives directly onto a dormitory or a day room. There is an element of the demonstrative here. Part of the point of the plan is to signal the liberality of the institution to those who knew how to read asylum designs in this register. Floor plans were widely reproduced in the professional literature. But this kind of spatial configuration also had an impact on patients' lives. To sleep at night or to spend part of the day in a single space situated off a room with other people in it would have allowed for a certain level of integration of the patient in the community of other patients and staff in the pavilion. Often the door would be left open. The boundary between the isolated person and the rest of the pavilion's population was, or had the potential to be, permeable. Also notable here is the fact that there are 4 ways for all the patients to exit the pavilion into its adjoining garden. At Steinhof, the equivalent pavilion for noisy patients was a much more orderly affair. The corridor was alive and well in Steinhof's pavilions. The south fronts were devoted to a series of dormitories and day rooms, and the spaces for isolating patients were gathered together over here in this short wing to the northwest, separated from the rest of the patient spaces and giving onto the corridor. This arrangement meant that when patients were isolated, it was in a unit apart, reminiscent of the Topp-Abteilung of old. 2 of the rooms were pointedly labeled Einzelzelle, so you can see the top 2 are Einzelzimmer, and then the next 2 are Einzelzelle, isolation cell, on the floor plan, a reversion to an older way of speaking of asylum spaces, more comfortable with overt control. A hardening of borders can be seen as well in the relationship between inside and outside. Because of the elevated basement, the patients lacked direct access to the outdoors from the level they lived on. To move outside, even into the garden with its 8-foot wall, patients would have to wait until they were escorted en masse along the corridor, down the central stairwell to the basement, and out through another corridor to the exit. The alternative, if they wanted fresh air, was the balcony, lofty and elegant and enclosed in wire mesh. Was Steinhof modern? It was and it wasn't. It certainly made a strong case for being perceived as modern, and indeed as the most modern of institutions. As historians and critical thinkers, The challenge is for us not to be dazzled by its rhetoric, and indeed to understand why such rhetoric was seen as necessary, to investigate what ends it served. The CEU is well positioned both to care for the built legacy of Steinhof and to keep asking questions about its history. It is a history that can offer insights into the difficult modernity that we are grappling with now more than ever. Thank you very much.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to speak after such a splendid talk. So thank you, Leslie. I would like to depart from the anti-psychiatric or anti-asylum movement that Leslie Topp mentioned as an important context for the assessment of the building of Steinhof. I would like to provide further framework of turn-of-the-century psychiatry to understand the contemporary role of Steinhof and also to connect its early history to the darker chapters during the Second World War already discussed in previous talks. Now, the second part of the 19th century was marked by the rise of university psychiatry, first in the German-speaking countries. In addition to the already existing mental asylums that we had a very nice kind of introduction to, the university clinic and laboratory emerged as the modern and progressive sites for psychiatric research into the brain and the nervous system. New and distinct research practices became emblematic of academic psychiatry: brain dissection, histological laboratory work, microscopic observation, and experimental research. Now, laboratory investigations, the concentration on brain anatomy and the pathophysiological and neurological mechanisms of psychiatric disorders, at the first gave rise to great hopes, but in the end failed to advance therapeutics. New studies confirmed the organic nature of some mental diseases, such as the cause of paralysis in neurosyphilis. We can come back to this later, and claimed that many underlying pathological processes were irreversible. This was coupled with the disastrous conditions that were discovered to prevail in overcrowded asylums and hospital wards by the 1880s, as mentioned by the lecturer, as a result of which a general therapeutic pessimism pervaded psychiatry. This therapeutic nihilism urged psychiatrists to look for alternative therapeutic solutions in other types of institutions and psychiatric practices. We thus see a fragmenting, So we thus see a fragmenting institutional landscape and a move from heterogeneous to homogeneous, specialized institutions based on the model of tuberculosis clinics. Just think of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. So what I'm trying to do here is to just flash at other alternative institutional attempts or possibilities, especially prevalent in Central and Eastern Europe. So there we see by the turn of the century, along with the criticism of large mental asylums, the ardent lobbying for an establishment of institutes for epileptics, imbeciles, in quotation mark, idiot children. I mean, these are terminologies of the time, so you will excuse this. Criminals, also alcoholics, nervous patients, etc. Creating homogeneous little islands of particular psychiatric illnesses in the vast sea of mental and social pathology seemed at the time a more viable solution for psychiatric and social problems than the large institutions that functioned as a melting pot of mental disorders. Even the kind of more separated and more distinctive approach by the Pavilion System, etc. These would be very specialized institutions compared to those. As further alternatives, from the first years of the 20th century, we see also a strong propagation of family care for the mentally ill alongside such formations as colonies. I think that colonies very often resemble what we heard in the lecture as well, spacious mental institutions consisting of many small houses rather than huge closed buildings and forming a mostly self-sustaining economic unit organized around some agricultural or other occupation, which also functioned as work therapy. Yet what we see in East Central Europe is a combination of such colonies very often with the characteristics of family care. And when psychiatric development, institutional developments throughout Europe, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, we really see very different models. And for instance, family care was a Scottish kind of paradigm. What we see is nevertheless that kind of a combination of colony with family cares, where there was mostly a center with some psychiatric expertise at a hospital ward or an existing small mental institutions, but patients were mostly cared for in real villages. So it was not just either at nursing staffs, families, or absolutely lay villagers. This would really come close to the kind of homely environment that we can imagine. Now, with these institutional alternatives, we see the attempt to rid the traditional asylum from the troublesome and the incurable, to give a chance to treat those who remained. But also, so basically, I can't go into detail, but epileptics and other imbeciles, idiotic children in quotation mark, these were really the groups of mental patients seen as the most troublesome in patient populations. Criminals, I mean, psychiatrists really wrote very lengthily and in details about the very great disadvantage that these elements had by their presence in mental asylums. So that was the advantage for the asylums, but also these were to provide these most hopeless patients with a chance for a better, more humane existence. Not harmful patients, even if incurable, should be sent to a colony or family care, psychiatrists argued, together with patients who would benefit from the freer air and living from agricultural work and other traditional occupations. So many of these alternatives were presented and seen not only as advantageous for the larger asylums, but also for the patients themselves. Now, the next point I would like to emphasize, and in more detail, is that the progressing disciplinary and institutional fragmentation of psychiatry went hand in hand with a gradual extension of psychiatric expertise into the public and private spheres of life by the turn of the century. This is going to lead us to some form of a continuity, as you will see. So psychiatry gradually moved beyond its narrowly defined disciplinary area and increasingly became a public affair, formally investing mostly in the pathological realm of life and concerned with mental patients, individuals, or institutional populations. Psychiatrists now extended their agency or professional expertise in the larger social domain and focused on more general social problems and their potential influence on healthy people, crowds, but even the nation. They did this through publications on grave social problems, mostly of the urban milieu, such as alcoholism, prostitution, crime, poverty, but also on the impact of industrialization, of modern lifestyle, and the exhaustion of one's vital powers, written for an audience much broader than the medical profession. They also gave popular science talks and participated in popular movements concerning public health issues, such as eugenics or the temperance movement. I mean, there is a great deal of overlap between these movements, and we see very similar language, and we hear very similar language echoed. It's not always easy to actually dismantle, for instance, what would count as belonging to eugenics. Now, parallel to this development, psychiatry also gradually invaded the private sphere of healthy people by constructing what a healthy mental, physical, spiritual, and sexual life consisted of, laying emphasis on prophylaxis. As a result, psychiatry attained a cultural monopoly over the hygiene of everyday life, as well as the factors contributing to the health of society by the first decades of the 20th century, so precisely this time. To illustrate this new mission of the psychiatrist, I would like to quote the mental pathologist and asylum doctor Károly Lechner from his speech at the Second National Alienist Congress held in 1902 in Budapest. In a Darwinian vein, the Lechner discussed in detail 3 of the most dangerous factors in the struggle for existence and race preservation: alcoholism, syphilis related to prostitution, and pauperism, all of which resulted in the mind and mind's exhaustion. In his argument, alcohol, prostitution, pauperism, and crime interact in a vicious circle tied together by the concept of degeneration. Sorry, just need to, sorry, this was my quote. So, no. The abuse of, no, yes. The abuse of alcohol leads to the degeneration of the organic structure and the psychic character and to early death. But its greatest curse is that the degeneracy of the alcoholic's cerebrum is passed down for 4 generations within the family. Likewise, another quote from him: prostitution generates syphilis. Syphilis generates degeneration that thrusts many into prostitution, into vice, others into alcoholism, again others into insanity due to paralysis progressiva or tabes dorsalis. Paralysis, inflicting 1/4 of all mental patients, attacks its victims in the prime time of their manhood. It begins with an early moral blindness and destroys whole families before it kills the patient. Now, the solution was not simply what characterized early psychiatric belief, the patient's cure through individualized treatment. What the new solution added to this was intervention on the social level, the elimination of the social roots of mental illnesses, strictly implemented with the psychiatrist's expertise. One more quote. So to stop the quick further spreading of paralysis progressiva throughout the country can only be achieved by the overall reform of prostitution. In this, the psychiatrist has to give a helping hand. Similarly, in cases of pauperism and poverty, which according to Lechner directly affected the brain, but also brought with it parasitism, work avoidance, vagabondism, alcoholism, and vice, all of which predisposed one to mental illnesses and formed, quote, the hotbed not only of mental disorders, but dangerous social maladies of anarchism and nihilism, end of quote. The solution was again intervention on the social level with the active participation of psychiatrists. They were to help in establishing further public charity institutions and designing better policy aimed at the poor. The psychiatrist no longer posed simply as the master of the deluded mind and nervous disorders, but also as the healer of social maladies. With his expertise, he claimed to intervene into the formation of policy towards the poor and thus improving their living and working conditions, defining the principles of child rearing, etc., quote, according to the guidance of the professional psychiatrist. Last quote, and then I finish. So informed by Darwinism, degenerationist and eugenic thinking, although he was by no way acclaimed eugenicist, Lechner claimed that degeneration and certain pathological dispositions were the tools of natural selection, and the nature's aim to, quote, muster out the weak and unfit, end of quote, served the interest of the majority in the end. Lechner was also curious and somewhat optimistic about the degenerative effects of society, quote, but nature set regeneration against degeneration. With the mixing of blood, the strengthening of new abilities and their transmittal, the decaying genus may flourish again, end of quote. The key to regeneration, according to him and most of his psychiatrist colleagues, was prophylaxis, as defined by the expert psychiatrist. So in order to fight degeneration, Lechner suggested a hygiene of reproduction, quote, the expedient manipulation of marriage, upbringing, and social life, end of quote. Rather than siding with the prohibition of reproduction in cases of people whose offspring endangers the health of society, Lechner claimed that the doctor's duty was to implement the hygiene of reproduction via educating the public, spreading the repugnance against damaging marriages, and enlightening people about, quote, imprudent connubility via the increased influence of family doctors experienced in psychiatry. Now, many more examples could be quoted to prove my point. With these developments I discussed above, psychiatrists were gradually attributed expertise in the hygiene of everyday life, as well as some control over the health of society. So they touched politics and formed a social critique in ways unprecedented in psychiatric history. This is thus also the context to understand Steinhof and its legacy, as well as the grounds for certain continuities with the darker chapters in its history. And if you allow me, I will just show you two more images, not as splendid as Leslie's, but this is Karel Lechner became the head of the university clinic in Cluj, of the Department and Clinic of Mental and Nervous Disorders. This is a new building on the turn of the century that was designed partly by him. I show you now the image of his own villa, which was designed by his brother Ödön Lechner. He himself is the founder of Hungarian secessionist architecture. And I just want to point at the fact that although at the time this was his personal family villa, this today functions as a mental institution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for two wonderful lectures by Leslie Topp and by Emese Lafferton, which actually very much complemented each other. Not only is Leslie a specialist in the Austrian half of the monarchy and Emese in the Hungarian half of the dual monarchy, but also Leslie's focused really on the architecture and the ideology behind the architecture, and Emese's focus on really the what was seen as the cutting edge psychiatric science at the time. And I think it's very fitting that Emese ended her talk with a private residence that was converted into a psychiatric hospital, because so much of what we're dealing with right now is the opposite. And I know that Leslie Topp has also dealt with this as well, the conversion of psychiatric hospitals in the UK especially, but also elsewhere, into housing estates and in many cases into educational institutions such as ours. I want to make a few comments and ask one or two questions, but I want to remind everybody in the audience right now that if you have questions, the best way to ask them is in chat, and I will curate these questions and give our two speakers an opportunity to answer them. So right now is a good time to start writing questions in chat if you have some, or comments for that matter. Leslie, one of the things that really struck me about your talk in particular is this focus on classification, categorization, hierarchy, order, and even symmetry. And of course, you're describing this from the perspective of an architectural historian. And I'm wondering to what extent this focus on order and symmetry and hierarchy in architecture somehow influences the way that the hospital itself approaches questions of psychiatric illness or, again, disorders, and trying to impose some sort of order. Another thing that really struck me was the focus on the oral, A-U-R-A-L. And that there was a lot, this I think was apparent in both of the talks, this concern with the noisy patients. That there was even a categorization, as you mentioned, of noisy, semi-quiet, and quiet. And that so much of the architectural design was focused on somehow containing or controlling what were seen as excessive noises. And maybe you could also comment on this concern with the oral and with noise in general in the architecture of psychiatric hospitals in this period. And another thing that struck me in Emese's talk in particular was that the terminology that's being used at the turn of the century. What struck me was, imbecile and idiot children. I looked through a lot of the admissions reports from Spiegelgrund, and I've quoted from them at the beginning of the past three lectures. And the exact same language is used. And it strikes me in the 1940s, when a child is diagnosed as being an idiot or being an imbecile, and I wonder if maybe you could talk about somehow the connection between this terminology being used at the turn of the century and how it develops in the 1930s and 1940s.
Right. Shall I come in and address your two questions about symmetry and noise? So I think that's well observed, that the very kind of architectural the architectural emphasis of this categorization of and that the central axis of the institution and the division of the institution into these two equal halves, which then are broken down into further categories that all mirror each other across the central axis, is something that goes really quite far back in the design of institutions. If the most famous, very early example being the Bethlem in London, which has medieval origins, but then has its magnificent new building built for it in the 1670s by Robert Hooke, where you have a kind of classically planned building that are always planned, especially public buildings, symmetrically around a central axis, with the kind of main emphasis in the center, where the director's offices and the kind of power center of the institution would be, and then men and women arranged in equal spaces on either side. I mean, one interesting implication that had is that it was extremely unusual to find an institution, even in the Willis system asylums, where you would have different numbers of pavilions and beds for men and for women, even though the statistics may have shown that there was a greater need. I think, I mean, Emese can correct me, but I think if there was a greater need, it would have been for male beds than female beds. But in any case, there's that constant symmetry and mirroring played out, which does have this architectural emphasis. And so sometimes, if, for instance, at Alt Scherbitz and in other institutions I could have shown, there is a very there's a huge effort. If you want to be non-symmetrical, if you want to be asymmetrical, informal, get away from that kind of mirroring division around the central axis, you have to make a real effort to do so. And so you really don't find it all that often, even when architects are pushing in that direction, because they want something much less kind of formal and rigid looking. For reasons of trying to convey a more natural, informal imagery around the asylum. And in terms of noise, those descriptions, quiet, semi-quiet, noisy, they of course stand for larger issues around patient behavior. But yes, there is a lot of attention to sound and to the fact that that a lot of loud noises could make a living environment, especially when you have a lot of people living together in dormitory accommodation, needed to be taken into account. And the most kind of vivid example of the response to this is the development of the padded cell, which really starts out in something I'm looking into now in my research on British institutions, starts out in the 1830s, both in order to to be able to seclude patients in such a way where they won't injure themselves. So you don't need to chain them to the bed in order for them to not injure themselves by trying to destroy the room and so on. The padding is supposed to contain all of that. But the other feature of the padding that was expressed at the time is that it was very effective soundproofing, so that the raving ward becomes, the impact of that on the rest of the institution is suppressed through padding. Yeah.
May I just add something to the whole idea of noise and its, why it was problematic? I mean, just for us to clarify, this is really a period of time before really effective pharmaceutical component. So basically, there was no way to really sedate. I mean, there were sedatives, laxatives available, but they could not do the kind of miracle that modern pharmaceutical products can. So we are talking about asylums where people were madly shouting if they got into a deranged situation. Hence, it must have been extremely not only troublesome but also frightening, and that was part of the reason why they wanted to eventually get rid of, literally get rid of such noisy patients if they could. But that was almost equal to impossibility.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask questions from Michael Ignatieff and from Maria Kronfeldner, which both deal with the separate nature of this institution, which develops its own. Again, it has a theater. It has it's a city of its own, really. So why is there a theater in the design? What function is it supposed to fulfill? What is the communal vision of Steinhof? And what is its relationship to, and partly what is its relationship to the rest of Vienna? And what is the relationship between public and private here? So I think these are primarily for Leslie.
Okay. So yes, the church and the theater, the church certainly was a conventional element of psychiatric institutions. It had been for a long time. But in the corridor style asylum, it wasn't a separate structure. It was a chapel space, usually within that central axis of buildings. And what happens in the villa system is that the chapel then becomes detached from the building, and it takes on its own identity and its own physical form, which is something that was very attractive for architects who wanted to be involved, because a church is a very kind of high prestige, interesting thing to design that allows you to grapple with the history of architecture. The theater was also there in some of those earlier corridor style asylums, just in the form of a large assembly room of some kind. And that's really what the theater served as at Steinhof as well. So it's called a theater, and it has a stage, but all sorts of different activities took place there: cinema viewings, slideshows, anything that involved bringing large groups of people together. Also, I understand things like dances, parties, entertainments. And so these were all part of something that had been included in asylum thinking and management for many decades, which was a kind of distraction for the patients. The idea that part of the therapy was to distract you from, dwelling on the state of your health, and especially as a kind of reward for patients that were well behaved. So it was very much up to, of course, the doctors and the attendants who got to attend church, who got to attend the events that took place in the theater. It's worth saying as well, I think I'm right about this, I don't want to get it wrong, and someone will correct me if I do, that there were also Jewish services that were held, if I understand right, in another building. And I think it was the Mortuary Building in the chapel there. But in any case, there was some provision for Jewish worship. So yeah, that was really the point of those places. And you ask what kind of vision of Steinhof as a community they imply, and this relates to the other question about Steinhof as a city on its own and how that relates to its relationship to the outside world. I mean, it was all about being self-contained, about having everything go on within the boundaries of the institution, that the patients would never really need to leave, and they could be provided with everything they wanted there. And indeed, so could the staff. It's worth keeping in mind that there was huge facilities on site for housing for staff, and the assumption was that almost all the staff would live there on site, from the director down to nurses and attendants. And so they were facilities meant to serve them as well. And there was the element of self-containment too in the agricultural facilities. So patients worked in the fields to the back of the institution, and those fields and the livestock and so on produced food and resources for the institution. Likewise, the laundry, sewing workshops, shoemaking workshops, etc. And so there's Steinhof particularly has very little that knits it into Vienna, even though it's actually quite close to Vienna compared to the location of some institutions in relation to the cities that they're attached to. The idea of the Pflegerdorf, this nurses' village that you see that I showed you at Mauer Erling, that is there in most institutions of this period as a transitional zone. It sits just outside the boundaries of the institution. It's meant to kind of signal that there is a way out of the institution and that there's a desire to kind of to knit together what happens in the institution with what happens outside. But that never existed at Steinhof.
Thank you. No, it seems that this is, an institution which was meant to be cut off from the city, and I'm thinking about what happens there 3.5 decades later, and to what extent this may actually be, the architecture of Steinhof may somehow have enabled what happened 3.5 decades later, or at least facilitated it in some way, that this was kept from the public eye. Two questions that I'm going to ask together. One is from Carsten Wilke and one is from Matthias Riedel, who are both interested in the political doctrine and the Christian socials on the one hand, and in Emese's presentation, really this focus on a kind of a Darwinist approach, which is not usually associated with Christian socialism. And the question from Carsten is, to what extent was Karl Lueger, the Christian social mayor of Vienna at the turn of the century, involved in the planning or development of Steinhof? Karl Lueger being famous as the anti-Semitic mayor who also inspired, who not only gave Vienna water from the Alps, but also inspired Hitler, who was in Vienna at the time. And what Matthias has pointed out here is that there seems to be a conflict of ideologies, is that, as Leslie explained, Christian Democratic, the Christian Democrats emphasized social outcasts, whereas Emese placed the emphasis on Darwinist physiological background with an emphasis on biological degeneration. So there's two very different ideologies here that are influencing the development of psychiatric hospitals, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this apparent conflict of ideologies.
Shall I start by addressing the Karl Lueger question? So I haven't come across any evidence that he did have a strong involvement. It's important to make a distinction between the Christian social government of Lower Austria and the government of Vienna. There was the municipal structures in Vienna that had Karl Lueger in charge of them as mayor. He was elected the year after the Christian Socialists came to power in the government of Lower Austria. That said, there was, because for several reasons, including the fact that the headquarters of Lower Austria were not in St. Pölten at that time the way they are now, but were in Vienna itself. And the fact that it was the Christian Socialists came to power at right around the same time in both places. There was a lot of collaboration. They all knew each other. They were all colleagues and close, collaborators with each other. So I'm sure that I'm sure that he knew all about it. Franz Berger, who took over from Carlo von Bogas, leading the whole building project, and he, I think I've got this right, the head of the Bauamt for Vienna. So he was kind of seconded from Vienna into this project. So there was undoubtedly close collaboration between the two. And the things that you could say about Karl Lueger, you could certainly say about the officials that were involved, even if they're not remembered as well, the officials that were involved in Steinhof. in terms of a conflict of ideologies, I think what you need to be a bit, and I think I can be faulted for this as well. You need to be a bit careful about trying to find a kind of direct match of ideas that are in the air in psychiatry, in politics, and then what's built on the ground, and whether you could trace that kind of that level of conflict between these two approaches to the patient or to the mentally ill person in exactly how the institution was run. I don't know. It may be that you would need to look there more carefully at the specific psychiatrists who were involved in running Steinhof and things like case notes and how patients were described, the treatments that were offered. And I really hope that the series will invite a scholar who's done the research with that kind of material that might be able to address some of those things. But Emese might want to come in on that too.
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, I referred to and elaborated on degenerationist thinking as a very pervasive idea underpinning much theoretical reasoning and theory at the time, because it was just basically serving as a very good explanatory framework. And also there were scientific theories of inheritance that were underpinning it. Now, degenerationist thinking really begins from the mid-19th century, from the French Moral, who worked with what he called crétins, labeled as crétins. And this is where he started out. I mean, obviously, he described degeneration as a downward progressive degeneration from one generation to the next. So something that seems to be linked with later with theories of hard inheritance. So notions that basically you inherit your biological genetic material, although it wouldn't be put in these in these phrases at the time. But I want to point at one very important thing is that as eugenics evolves by and after the turn of the century, we see different theories of inheritance, hard heredity ideas, as well as Lamarckian social ideas of inheritance, idea that basically acquired characteristics throughout your life will also or can also be inherited, as equally influential theories which can be coupled with different political ideas, but they were not exclusive, and both could have very strongly interventionist outcomes and implementations. So but we know that as eugenics develops in different cultural and political contexts in Europe and elsewhere, in basically globally, everywhere almost, we see very different political contexts and political cultures embracing it and using it for their own purposes. And so basically these were not necessarily contradictory. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
Thank you. There are a number of questions in the chat about noise. This seems to be a topic of great interest to people, and I encourage you to look at those. They're mostly comments as well. One about whether, and there's a question about whether or not singing is considered noise, and about the medicalization of noise in this period. We don't have that much time left, and I wanna take advantage of having Leslie here as well. Emese is a member of the visioning group, so this is something we can discuss all together. But one of the images that you used at the beginning of your talk was a kind of a white city on the hill, right? And of course, the university is often described as an ivory tower. And I'm wondering if there's certain lessons from this difficult modernity that you've talked about and that you've written about, which you've applied to psychiatric institutions at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And are there certain lessons that we can learn when thinking about an institution of higher education, which is moving into this site? And maybe you have some reflections on that or suggestions or ideas for us as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a fascinating transformation, and I want to give a name check to my PhD student, Patrick Quinlan, who's working on the conversion of psychiatric hospitals in Ireland into to various uses, including there's a campus in Dublin that's been converted from a psychiatric hospital into a campus for their technical university. So this isn't the first time this has happened. It also, the Trieste University is partly located in the institution there, which is of the same period as Steinhof. But I don't, I think that it presents a really exciting opportunity for reflection on the history of the site through an academic context, but also on, yes, on the fact that the university does have this ivory tower metaphor and context, and that this is particularly a phenomenon, isn't it? Not so much of Europe, but of North America, of the campus that is that's separate from any city that it's attached to, and that where the relations between campus life and city life are often quite fraught, and there are, if they're neglected, those connections, that can lead to issues. So I think that the fact that you're, rather than building a new campus for yourselves somewhere separate, you're moving into this place that has already kind of gone through that process of separating itself and yet also somehow being connected, and the dangers and opportunities that a separate space provides. You can approach that, in a way that has your eyes open to those dangers and possibilities. I mean, that's very abstract, but I think I feel very optimistic about the possibilities there of keeping the history of the site always in mind, and using it as a lens through which to reflect on these issues that have to do with how a university as an institution operates, because institutions often, as institutions, share dimensions that are worth thinking about.
Thank you. Emese, do you want to add anything to this, or okay? No, I think it's also interesting because I once was an archaeologist, and we talk a lot about what's called continuity of cult, that a temple to one god is destroyed and then a new temple to another god is built upon this. And you use this imagery of a utopian city where there is a cultic center, which is of course the church at Steinhof. And we're dealing with certain kinds of continuities here and ruptures. We generally think about the problematic history of the National Socialist period and the legacy of Spiegelgrund in particular. And I think today's talks, Leslie's talk and Emese's response, were very, very insightful in actually thinking about the legacy of a psychiatric hospital. And this is something that we haven't focused on as much. It's much more been the legacy of a psychiatric hospital which was engaged in atrocities and child murder in the 1940s. And there are interesting, I think, legacies here. And this is an idea to build some sort of utopia, but a utopia that in the end was cut off from its surroundings and cut off from the city. And this is maybe something that we also should be thinking a lot more about, is what is the role of this university, which is on the periphery of Vienna, but is meant to somehow engage all of Vienna and of course, academia beyond Vienna. And I think this is one of the challenges that is also highlighted in the talks today. I want to thank Leslie and Emese for giving wonderful talks today and really helping us think more about the legacy of not just Spiegelgrund, but the legacy of Steinhof, the psychiatric hospital that has occupied its site since 1907. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And we will have more talks in the future. This is the last one that is planned right now for this semester, but there will be additional talks in this Reckoning with the Legacy of Steinhof series. So thank you again to everybody for participating.